Brielle Thornwood had learned long ago that nobody noticed omegas. Not when they worked, not when they suffered, and certainly not when they cried. For 3 years, she had cared for the pack's pups, while stronger wolves received praise, promotions, and recognition. She fed abandoned pups, comforted frightened pups, stayed awake through sleepless nights when young wolves were sick. Yet whenever pack leaders spoke of valuable wolves, her name was never mentioned. By now, she was used to it. Used to being invisible. Used to hearing that an omega's purpose was simply to serve. So when Lycan King Jaciel arrived for his royal inspection, Brielle expected nothing to change. Why would it? Kings didn't notice wolves like her. They noticed warriors, betas, future Lunas. Not a nursery caretaker whose hands always smelled faintly of milk and herbs. But that morning, as Brielle knelt beside a frightened little pup and wrapped him in a blanket, she heard a voice behind her. A voice powerful enough to silence the entire nursery. "What exactly can you offer this kingdom, Omega?" Brielle froze. Slowly, she looked up, and for the first time in her life, the Lycan King was looking directly at her. Before we continue, if stories about kindness, resilience, and unexpected love are the kind of stories that stay with you long after they end, then you're in the right place. Take a second to subscribe and join our growing family. Every subscription helps us bring more heartfelt werewolf stories like this to life, and we'd truly love to have you with us on this journey. Now, let's see what happened when the one omega everyone overlooked unknowingly captured the attention of the most powerful wolf in the kingdom. Chapter 1. Morning arrived long before the sun reached the towering cliffs surrounding Mooncrest Pack. While warriors sharpened their blades for another day of training and commanders barked orders across the courtyard, a different kind of battle quietly unfolded inside the nursery. Tiny cries echoed through the warm stone hall. One frightened pup refused to eat after losing both parents during a rogue attack. Another hid beneath a table, convinced his older brother would never return from the border patrol. A little girl sat silently in the corner, clutching a worn cloth wolf so tightly her tiny knuckles had turned white. Brielle Thornwood moved from one child to the next with quiet patience. She never rushed them. She never told them to stop crying. Instead, she listened. She knelt before the little girl and smiled gently. "Would you like me to braid your hair today?" The pup gave the smallest nod. Within minutes, the little girl was smiling shyly at her own reflection in the polished window. Across the room, another pup burst into tears after falling while chasing the others. Before anyone else could react, Brielle scooped him into her arms. "Oh, brave wolves don't cry because they fall," she whispered with a warm smile. "They cry because it hurts, and then they stand back up." The little boy sniffled. "Really? Really?" She kissed the top of his head before setting him back on his feet. "There. Now show me how brave you are." He grinned before racing back toward the others. Moments like these filled Brielle's days. Not ceremonies, not celebrations, just countless little hearts, needing someone to remind them they mattered. She never complained, because somewhere along the way, she'd realized that healing a frightened pup didn't always require herbs or medicine. Sometimes, it simply required kindness. "Brielle," she turned as Elowen, the nursery matron, entered carrying a basket of folded blankets. "The youngest pups barely slept last night. I'll stay with them during their nap," Brielle answered without hesitation. "You stayed until moonrise yesterday. They needed someone." Elowen studied the young omega for a long moment. "You always say that." Brielle only smiled. "Because it's always true." The older woman sighed softly. "I wish the rest of this pack saw what I see." Brielle lowered her eyes. "They don't have to." But the words carried more sadness than she intended. The truth was, she had grown used to being overlooked. As an omega, she occupied the lowest place in the pack's hierarchy. Warriors earned cheers. Healers earned respect. Commanders earned honor. Even the cooks received praise during festivals. But nursery caretakers? Most wolves forgot they existed. Whenever council meetings celebrated the pack's greatest contributions, no one mentioned the wolves raising the next generation. Sometimes Brielle wondered if disappearing completely would make any difference at all. The pups would notice. But would anyone else? Her thoughts were interrupted by excited voices drifting through the open windows. The Lycan King arrives today. I heard his entire royal guard is coming. They say even the commanders are nervous. Within minutes, the entire pack seemed transformed. Servants hurried through the village carrying fresh flowers. Warriors polished their armor until it gleamed. High-ranking she-wolves adjusted elegant dresses, each secretly hoping the king might remember her face. The nursery, however, remained exactly the same, a forgotten corner of the pack. One servant passing outside laughed. Good thing the king's inspection won't waste time in there. His companion chuckled. Why would a Lycan King visit a room full of crying pups? Their footsteps faded. Brielle pretended she hadn't heard. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the nursery floor as a circle of pups gathered around her. Story time? One little boy asked excitedly. She nodded. Today, I'll tell you about the smallest wolf in the forest. The strongest? Another pup guessed. No. The fastest? She laughed. Neither. The children leaned closer. He was the kindest. The room grew wonderfully quiet. Brielle spoke of a tiny wolf who couldn't fight like the older wolves or run as quickly as the scouts. But whenever another animal was frightened, hungry, or alone, he was always the first to help. In the end, she finished softly, the forest remembered his kindness, long after everyone forgot who won the biggest battles. The pups applauded. One little girl wrapped her arms around Brielle's neck. I want to be like him. Brielle hugged her tightly. I think you already are. Outside, royal horns suddenly echoed across Mooncrest. Every adult froze. The Lycan King had arrived. Heavy footsteps filled the courtyard. Orders were shouted. Pack leaders rushed toward the entrance. Even Elowen straightened her uniform before whispering, "Stay here with the little ones." Brielle nodded. She had no reason to leave. Kings didn't notice wolves like her. Several minutes later, the nursery doors opened. A line of royal guards entered first. Silver armor gleamed beneath shafts of sunlight. Behind them walked Mooncrest's Alpha, followed by council elders. Then, the room fell completely silent. Lycan King Jaciel stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered. His black cloak flowed behind him like a living shadow, while piercing golden eyes quietly surveyed every corner of the nursery. Every adult immediately bowed. Brielle started to do the same, but a frightened little pup clutched her hand. The child had hidden behind her the moment strangers entered. "It's all right," Brielle whispered, kneeling beside him. "You're safe." Only after the little boy stopped trembling did she slowly stand and lower her head. Jaciel had been watching. His gaze never left her. Finally, he spoke. "You." The room stiffened. Brielle looked up nervously. "Yes. Alpha, what contribution do you make to this kingdom?" A few warriors exchanged amused glances. "An Omega? What could an Omega possibly offer a kingdom?" Brielle swallowed. She wasn't a commander. She wasn't a healer. She wasn't gifted with extraordinary strength. She possessed no noble bloodline. Only an ordinary heart. She began quietly. "I can't offer much, Alpha." Soft laughter rippled through several watching wolves. But Brielle continued without lifting her eyes. "But I can care for pups." Silence swept across the nursery. The laughter vanished. For one long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Lycan King Jaciel stared at the young Omega before him. Not at her simple clothing, not at the mark that identified her low rank, but at the quiet sincerity in her words. And for reasons even he could not explain. The answer stunned him. Chapter 2. The grand residence of the Lycan King was unlike any other place in Mooncrest. Its towering stone walls overlooked the entire territory, reminding every wolf that power lived at the highest point of the mountain. Yet for Prince Kieran, it had never felt like home. Every morning began the same way. Before sunrise, attendants quietly entered his chamber. One prepared his clothes. Another brushed his dark hair into perfect order. A third reviewed the day's schedule, while 2 royal guards waited outside his door. Breakfast with your tutors. History lessons after sunrise. Sword drills before midday. Royal etiquette this afternoon. The list never changed. Neither did the answer Kieran wanted to give. I don't want to. But future Lycan Kings weren't allowed to complain. They obeyed, even when they were only 8 years old. As he sat before a table filled with fresh bread, roasted meat, berries and honey, Kieran pushed the food around his plate without taking a bite. "Your Highness," one caretaker said politely, "you must eat." "I'm not hungry. You said that yesterday, and the day before," she sighed. "Your father expects you to stay strong." Kieran lowered his eyes. Everyone always spoke about what his father expected. No one ever asked what he felt. After breakfast came history, then combat, then lessons on leadership. Every tutor praised discipline. Every commander praised strength. Every elder reminded him that one day the kingdom would rest upon his shoulders. Not one of them noticed how lonely those shoulders already felt. When the afternoon lessons finally ended, Kieran wandered to the enormous balcony overlooking Mooncrest. From there, he could see nearly the entire territory. Warriors sparred in the training grounds, merchants filled the marketplace, children chased one another through the village below. His gaze drifted farther, toward a small stone building near the eastern gardens. The nursery. Laughter floated through its open windows. Real laughter. Not the polite smiles he saw every day inside the royal residence. Kieran rested both hands on the railing. "They always sound happy." One of the guards standing nearby answered without thinking. "They're only pups, Your Highness. Only pups." The words stayed with him. When had he stopped being one? That evening, another formal dinner awaited him. Dozens of nobles filled the hall. Conversations revolved around politics, borders, alliances, and training. Kieran barely touched his meal. Across the room sat his father, Lycan King Jaciel. The king's attention remained fixed on discussions with commanders and council members. Kieran knew his father loved him. He had never doubted that. But love and time were not always the same thing. Some nights, they barely exchanged more than a few words. By the time dinner ended, Kieran felt more exhausted than after an entire morning of sword practice. The following day brought another endless schedule. The same tutors, the same lessons, the same reminders that he was the future of the kingdom. When his etiquette instructor turned to retrieve another scroll, Kieran noticed the door standing slightly open. Outside, a servant hurried past, carrying linens toward the eastern gardens. Without thinking, he slipped into the corridor. His heart pounded as he hurried through quiet hallways, past marble pillars, past the kitchens, past the gardens where butterflies danced between blooming flowers. Behind him, distant voices echoed. The prince? Where did he go? He couldn't help smiling. For the first time in weeks, no one was telling him where to stand, or how to speak, or what to become. His feet carried him toward the sound that had drawn him from the balcony the day before. Children laughing. As he approached the nursery, he hesitated. Would they send him back? Would everyone bow and treat him like a prince again? Slowly, he stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of herbs, fresh bread, and warm milk. Several pups sat around a low wooden table, painting little wooden wolves in bright colors. Others stacked carved blocks into tiny castles. Near the window, Brielle Thornwood knelt beside two young brothers, helping them solve a puzzle. She looked up when she heard the door. For a brief moment, surprise crossed her face. Not because she recognized him, but because she'd never seen the child before. She smiled warmly. "There you are." Kieran blinked. "There, I am?" "I was wondering who was standing outside." She stood and walked toward him without ceremony. No bow, no nervous greeting, no frightened expression, only kindness. "You must be new." He hesitated. "I suppose." "Well," she said with a gentle laugh, "everyone is welcome here." She crouched until they were eye level. "I'm Brielle." "Kieran. It's nice to meet you, Kieran." No one called him Your Highness. No one addressed him as Prince, just Kieran. She held out her hand. "Would you like to help us?" He stared at her for a moment, before slowly taking it. Her hands were warm. She led him toward the table, where several pups were trying to build a tower from wooden blocks. "It keeps falling," one little girl complained. Brielle smiled. "Then maybe we need another builder." She looked at Kieran. What do you think? He carefully picked up one of the larger blocks. My tutor says strong foundations matter most. Your tutor is very wise. The children eagerly made room for him. Together they rebuilt the tower. When the final block settled into place without falling, the entire table erupted into cheers. One tiny pup hugged Kieran around the waist. We did it, Kieran laughed. Not the polite chuckle expected during royal gatherings. A real laugh. Bright, carefree, unrestrained. The sound filled the nursery. Brielle glanced toward him. For just a second, she noticed something in his eyes. Not pride, relief. As though he had finally found a place where no one expected him to be anything other than a child. And without realizing it, Prince Kieran smiled from the heart, for the very first time in a long, long while. Chapter 3. When Prince Kieran returned to the royal residence that evening, no one questioned why his cheeks were flushed with color. The guards assumed he had simply grown tired from wandering the gardens. His tutors blamed the afternoon sun. The attendants were only relieved they had found him before Lycan King noticed he had disappeared. No one imagined that for the first time in months, the young prince had actually enjoyed his day. That night, Kieran climbed into bed with a thought he couldn't shake. He kept hearing the sound of the pups laughing. He remembered the warmth in Brielle's smile when she had introduced herself, not to a prince, but to a little boy named Kieran. It was the first time in years someone had looked at him without expectation. She hadn't asked him to be brave, or wise, or perfect. She had simply asked if he wanted to help. The memory stayed with him until sleep finally claimed him. The following morning felt painfully familiar. His etiquette instructor corrected the way he held his teacup. His combat trainer reminded him that a future Lycan King could never hesitate. The royal historian spoke for nearly an hour about legendary rulers who had sacrificed everything for the kingdom. Kieran listened politely, but his thoughts kept drifting elsewhere, to a room that smelled of warm bread and herbs, to tiny paws running across stone floors, to a young Omega who somehow made frightened pups feel safe. The moment his morning lessons ended, he looked toward the corridor. His attendant noticed immediately. "Your Highness, your father requested another leadership lesson before lunch." Kieran lowered his eyes. "May I have a short walk first?" The attendant hesitated. Only a short one. Before anyone realized where he was heading, Kieran disappeared down the eastern path once again. The nursery door creaked softly. Several little heads turned. "It's Kieran!" one excited pup shouted. A tiny chorus of cheerful voices followed. "Kieran's back. We're building animals today. Come help us." Kieran couldn't stop the smile spreading across his face. Brielle looked up from where she was carefully wrapping a bandage around a young pup's scraped knee. "I was wondering if we'd see you again." "You were?" "Of course." She tied the bandage into a neat bow before helping the little boy to his feet. "There," she said warmly. "You'll be chasing everyone again by tomorrow." The pup grinned before running off. Brielle dusted her hands and walked over to Kieran. "Good morning. Good morning. I saved something for you." She reached beneath a nearby shelf and produced a small, unfinished wooden wolf. "I thought perhaps you'd like to paint one with the others." Kieran stared at the little carving. No one had ever saved something for him before. Not because they had been ordered to, simply because they thought he might enjoy it. "Thank you." For the rest of the morning, Kieran helped wherever he could. He stacked blankets after nap time. He handed out cups of warm milk. He helped one little girl tie the ribbon around her braid, exactly the way Brielle had shown him. Whenever a younger pup struggled to reach a shelf, he quietly lifted them. The nursery slowly stopped treating him like a visitor. He became part of the day's rhythm. Watching him, Brielle couldn't help smiling. "You learn quickly. My tutors say I have to." "And what do you think?" Kieran shrugged. "I don't know." She tilted her head gently. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, almost without realizing it, Kieran found himself speaking more honestly than he ever had. "Everyone keeps telling me who I'm supposed to become." Brielle remained silent, letting him continue. "They say I'll rule one day." He picked up another wooden block, turning it over in his hands. "They tell me I have to be strong. They tell me I can't make mistakes. They tell me everyone will depend on me. His voice grew quieter. But no one asks if I'm scared. Brielle's heart tightened. He was still just a child, yet the weight on his shoulders sounded heavier than armor. She knelt beside him until they were eye level. "Can I tell you something?" He nodded. "When I was little, I was afraid of thunderstorms." "You were?" She laughed softly. "Terrified." "What changed?" "My grandmother told me courage isn't the absence of fear." She gently tapped his chest. "It's choosing to keep going, even while you're afraid." Kieran looked down thoughtfully. "So, it's all right to be scared." "It's all right. And if someone tells you otherwise," she smiled warmly, "they've forgotten what it feels like to be little." For a long moment, Kieran simply looked at her. No lecture, no expectations, no reminder that he was the future king, only understanding. Something inside him quietly settled. "I like it here," he admitted. Brielle's smile softened. "We like having you here." Just then, several pups rushed toward them, carrying pieces of cloth. "Brielle, our blanket fort fell down," she laughed. "Well, we'd better rescue it." Kieran stood immediately. "I'll help." For the next hour, they worked side by side. Together, they rebuilt the fort. Together, they calmed a crying toddler frightened by a nightmare. Together, they filled the nursery with laughter that echoed far beyond its walls. Later that afternoon, as Kieran returned to the royal residence, something felt different. He wasn't dragging his feet. He wasn't staring at the ground. He greeted servants. He thanked an attendant who opened the door. When dinner was served, he actually finished his meal. Across the long table, Lycan King noticed. His son had barely eaten for weeks. Tonight, his plate was empty. More surprising still, Kieran smiled when one of the servants accidentally spilled water. Not a forced smile, a genuine one. Jasiel watched quietly. He said nothing. But as father and son left the dining hall, one question lingered in his mind. What had changed? Somewhere beyond the palace walls, inside a humble nursery that few considered important, the answer had already begun changing both of their lives. Chapter 4. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Every morning, Prince Kieran completed his royal lessons with unusual determination. His tutors were surprised. He no longer complained during history. He paid closer attention during combat training. He even finished his meals without gentle reminders from the attendants. They believed the young prince had finally accepted his responsibilities. Only Kieran knew the truth. The faster he completed his duties, the sooner he could return to the nursery. It became his favorite part of every day. By the end of the week, the little pups no longer looked surprised when he appeared at the doorway. Instead, excited voices immediately filled the room. "Kieran's here! Come play with us! Help me finish my drawing!" One tiny pup abandoned a pile of wooden blocks and sprinted toward him so quickly that he nearly tripped over his own feet. Kieran laughed as he caught the little boy before he hit the floor. "Easy there! I knew you'd come back! I told you I would!" The child beamed proudly before dragging him toward the others. Watching from across the room, Brielle couldn't help smiling. The lonely boy who had quietly stepped into the nursery only days earlier had somehow become one of its brightest lights. He remembered every pup's name. He celebrated every small victory. If one of them cried, he was always the first to kneel beside them. Without realizing it, he had begun learning leadership in a place no royal tutor would ever think to teach. That afternoon, Brielle gathered the pups into their usual circle near the fireplace. Outside, gentle rain tapped against the windows, while warm light danced across the nursery walls. "Story time," several pups cheered. Brielle settled onto a woven rug, waiting until every eager face turned toward her. Even Kieran quietly took his place among them. Today's story was about a young wolf who dreamed of becoming the strongest in the forest. He trained every day, Brielle began. He raced every wolf he met. He climbed the tallest cliffs and crossed the fastest rivers. Several pups listened with wide eyes. But one winter, she continued softly, a terrible storm swept through the forest. The strongest wolves ran to protect their own homes. The fastest wolves hurried to save themselves. She paused. Only the crackling fire could be heard. But the smallest wolf, He stayed behind. He carried frightened pups to safety one by one. He shared his food. He stayed with those who were too scared to sleep. One little girl raised her hand. Was he still the strongest? Brielle smiled warmly. No, he became something even greater. What? The one everyone trusted. Silence settled over the room. The words lingered. Kieran lowered his eyes. No commander had ever explained leadership that way. No tutor had spoken of kindness as strength, yet somehow it made perfect sense. When story time ended, the pups scattered toward different games. One little girl struggled to lift a heavy basket of toys. Before Brielle could move, Kieran hurried over.
I'll help.
Together they carried the basket across the room. Another young pup became frustrated while trying to tie his boots. Kieran knelt exactly as Brielle always did. Here, I'll show you. The little boy copied each movement carefully. When the knot finally held, his face lit up with pride. I did it! You did, Kieran laughed. Brielle watched quietly. She hadn't taught him through lectures. She had simply lived with kindness. And somehow, he had begun copying it. As the afternoon stretched on, rain gave way to soft sunlight. The nursery doors remained open to let in the fresh mountain air. Neither Brielle nor the pups noticed the tall figure standing just beyond the entrance. Lycan King Jaciel had come only to inspect the eastern wing before returning to the council chambers. The cheerful laughter drifting from the nursery had drawn him closer. He had intended to stay only a moment. Instead, he found himself watching. He saw Kieran sitting cross-legged on the floor, while two little pups proudly placed flower crowns on his head. He expected the prince to protest. Instead, Kieran laughed so hard he nearly fell backward. Another tiny pup climbed into Brielle's lap after scraping her elbow. Brielle cleaned the small cut with practiced care before kissing the child's forehead. There, our brave wolf is ready again. The little girl nodded confidently before running back to play. Jaciel remained perfectly still. This was not the prince he had watched slowly withdraw over the past year. The child before him smiled easily, spoke freely, looked happy. The king shifted his attention toward Brielle. She never sought attention. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She moved naturally from one pup to another, encouraging them, comforting them, celebrating them. No grand speeches, no desire for recognition, only quiet compassion. For the first time, Jaciel began to understand why his son kept disappearing every afternoon. It wasn't the games, it wasn't the toys, it wasn't even the nursery itself. It was how Brielle made everyone inside those walls feel. Seen, safe, important. A sudden burst of laughter drew his attention back to Kieran. The prince had somehow convinced half the nursery to build an enormous blanket fort. The younger pups proudly declared him their chief builder. Kieran looked toward Brielle with a grin. Do you think it'll stay up this time? She folded her arms thoughtfully. Only if its builders remember one important rule. What rule? Several pups asked together. She smiled. A strong home isn't held together by wood or blankets. It's held together by the people inside it. For a moment, no one spoke. Even Jaciel felt those words settle quietly in his heart. He looked once more at his laughing son. Then at the young Omega who had somehow accomplished what countless tutors, guards, and attendants never could. Without realizing it, Prince Kieran had found the place where he felt most at home, and Lycan King Jaciel walked away, carrying a single question he couldn't seem to answer. Who exactly was Brielle Thornwood? Chapter 5. The nursery had become quieter in one unexpected way. Whenever Prince Kieran arrived, the younger pups no longer fought over toys or argued about games. Instead, they ran to greet him. To them, he wasn't the future Lycan King. He was simply Kieran, the boy who laughed with them, built blanket forts with them, and never refused to help when someone needed an extra pair of hands. That morning, Brielle watched as Kieran patiently helped a tiny pup fasten the straps on his boots. You've got the left one backwards, Kieran said with a grin. The little boy frowned dramatically. I always do. Then we'll keep practicing. By the third attempt, the pup finally managed to tie them correctly. I did it. You did, Kieran said proudly, offering him a high five. The little wolf's joyful laughter filled the nursery. Brielle smiled to herself. The prince who had once walked through these doors, carrying the weight of the entire kingdom, now looked lighter with every passing day. Not because his responsibilities had disappeared, but because, for a little while each afternoon, he was allowed to simply be a child. As the morning continued, several younger pups gathered around Brielle for their reading lesson. Before she could begin, one tiny she-pup wandered to the doorway and froze. A loud clap of thunder echoed outside. Her small body trembled. Instantly, Brielle set the storybook aside. She crossed the room without hesitation and knelt beside the frightened child. "It's only the sky talking," she said softly. The little girl shook her head. "My mama said, storms take people away." Brielle's expression softened. She gently wrapped the child in a warm blanket before lifting her onto her lap. "Storms can be frightening," she whispered, "but they also bring rain. And rain helps flowers grow." The little girl looked up. "Really?" Brielle nodded. "Sometimes beautiful things begin after scary moments." Slowly, the child's breathing steadied. Kieran watched everything in silence. There was no special technique, no magic, just patience, just kindness. He quietly picked up the storybook Brielle had set aside and handed it back to her. "I think everyone's ready now," she smiled. "Thank you." Together, they gathered the pups into a circle. Today's lesson wasn't about letters or numbers. It was about courage. Brielle placed a single feather in the center of the circle. Who thinks courage means never being afraid? Several little paws shot into the air. She chuckled softly. A lot of wolves believe that. She picked up the feather. "But courage isn't pretending you're fearless." She handed it to the smallest pup. "It's being afraid, and choosing kindness anyway." The children listened carefully, even Kieran. "What if someone laughs at you?" one pup asked. "Then you keep being kind." "What if you're the smallest? You can still be kind." "What if nobody notices?" Brielle paused. Her smile remained gentle. Kindness doesn't become less valuable just because no one sees it. The words settled over the room. Kieran lowered his gaze. For some reason, he felt those words were meant for more than just the pups. Later that afternoon, Lycan King Jaciel arrived at the nursery. This time, he didn't come by accident. He told himself he simply wanted to see why his son insisted on spending so much time there. Nothing more. He remained near the entrance, unnoticed by the children. From where he stood, he watched Brielle move naturally through the room. She comforted a frightened toddler without interrupting another child's lesson. She praised a shy pup for speaking up during story time. She thanked every child who helped clean up after lunch. No one was overlooked, not even the quietest among them. Jaciel found himself comparing the nursery to the council chamber. In council meetings, wolves competed to be heard. Here, Brielle made sure everyone had a voice. His attention shifted toward Kieran. The prince was helping two younger pups stack wooden blocks into a tower. When the tower collapsed, both children looked ready to cry. Kieran simply laughed. "Then we'll build it again." The three of them started over together. Jaciel stared. Weeks ago, his son would have walked away in frustration. Now he encouraged others to keep trying. The change wasn't difficult to see. It was impossible to ignore. Elowyn quietly approached the king. "You've been watching for some time, Alpha." "I have. The young Omega has a rare gift." Jaciel remained silent. "She makes every child believe they matter." The king looked toward Brielle once more. She wasn't seeking praise. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She probably didn't even realize she was being observed. Everything she did came naturally, not because someone expected it, because it was simply who she was. For the first time, Jaciel understood something important. Strength could command obedience. Wisdom could earn respect. But kindness inspired trust, and trust was something no throne alone could ever guarantee. His respect for Brielle deepened. Not as a woman, not yet, but as someone whose quiet influence reached hearts more effectively than authority ever could. As he turned to leave, another figure stepped into the corridor. Valeria Thorncrest, elegant in a silver gown, embroidered with the crest of one of Mooncrest's oldest bloodlines. She had come hoping to speak privately with the king. Instead, she found him standing outside the nursery, watching an omega. Valeria followed his gaze. Her eyes settled on Brielle. The young caretaker was laughing, as several pups proudly presented a wildly crooked flower crown they had made together. Jaciel's expression softened ever so slightly. It lasted only a moment. But Valeria noticed. Her smile faded. She had spent months attending royal banquets, speaking with council members, presenting herself as the perfect future Luna. Yet the king's attention seemed drawn elsewhere, to a simple omega in a forgotten nursery. Valeria said nothing. She merely watched Brielle a little longer. Then she quietly turned away. A single thought lingered in her mind. Who exactly was Brielle Thornwood? And why had the Lycan King begun noticing her? Chapter 6. The first sign that something was wrong came just before sunrise. A frightened cry echoed through the nursery. Then another. Within moments, the peaceful room that usually welcomed each morning with laughter was filled with worried voices. One of the youngest pups lay curled beneath his blanket, shivering uncontrollably despite the warmth of the room. His breathing came in short, uneven gasps, while two other pups began coughing almost at the same time. Elowen's face paled. This isn't right. Brielle was already kneeling beside the first child. She gently rested the back of her hand against his forehead. His skin burned beneath her touch. "Bring cool water," she said calmly, "and fresh blankets." One of the attendants froze. What if it's spreading? Then panicking won't help them. Her voice remained steady. "Right now, they need us to stay calm." The room immediately became quieter. Even in the middle of uncertainty, Brielle's calmness settled over the nursery like a reassuring hand. Within minutes, every caretaker was moving with purpose instead of fear. Some prepared cool cloths. Others comforted frightened pups who were beginning to cry, simply because they sensed something was wrong. Brielle moved from bed to bed, checking each child carefully. She whispered encouraging words to every frightened little wolf. "No one is alone. We're going to take care of you. You're very brave." Not once did she allow fear to show on her face. News traveled quickly through Mooncrest. Before long, healers arrived carrying satchels of herbs. Royal guards secured the nursery to prevent unnecessary visitors. When the report reached the council chambers, Lycan King Jaciel immediately stood. "How many pups?" "We believe 6, Alpha." "And the prince?" "He was already on his way to the nursery." Jaciel's expression tightened. "Take me there." Inside the nursery, Kieran had already rushed to Brielle's side. "What happened?" "A few of the little ones have fallen ill," Brielle answered gently. "Can I help?" She looked at him for a brief moment before smiling. "You already are." "I am?" She placed a small basket into his hands. "Some of the younger pups are frightened. They trust you. Would you sit with them while I check on everyone else?" Kieran nodded immediately. "I can do that." He carried the basket to a quiet corner, where 3 nervous pups sat huddled together. "They're going to be okay," he told them. "How do you know?" "Because Brielle said we'll take care of everyone." The smallest pup looked toward Brielle across the room. "If Brielle says so, I believe her." The others slowly nodded. Fear gave way to hope. When Jaciel entered the nursery, organized determination had replaced the chaos he expected to find. Healers worked beside caretakers. Cool cloths were being changed regularly. The frightened children had been gathered together instead of left alone. At the center of it all was Brielle. She moved tirelessly from one child to another, checking temperatures, comforting tears, offering water, encouraging exhausted attendants. Not once did she stop to rest. Not once did she think of herself. A healer approached her. "We're running low on moonleaf." "I gathered fresh bundles yesterday," Brielle replied. "They're drying in the storage room. I'll fetch them." Before he could leave, another frightened pup began crying. "I don't want to sleep." Brielle immediately knelt beside the little girl. "You don't have to. What if I wake up sicker?" "You'll wake up with all of us still beside you." The child slowly reached for Brielle's hand. "Promise?" Brielle gently squeezed her fingers. "I promise." Standing several steps away, Jaciel watched the exchange in silence. There was no fear in Brielle's voice, only certainty. Not certainty that everything would be perfect, but certainty that no child would face hardship alone. For the first time in many years, the king saw courage that required no sword. Hours passed. Most of the younger pups had finally fallen asleep. The nursery grew unusually quiet. Brielle stepped outside into the courtyard for the first time that day. She leaned against the stone wall and closed her eyes. Only for a moment. "You haven't eaten." She opened her eyes to find Jaciel standing nearby. "I'll eat later." Later has already become evening. She looked toward the nursery doors. They needed me, and now they still do. Without another word, Jaciel handed her a small loaf of warm bread and a flask of water. She looked surprised. "You should keep your strength." For a second, Brielle didn't know what to say. No Alpha had ever concerned himself with whether she had eaten. "Thank you, Alpha." She accepted the food quietly. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The mountain breeze carried the scent of pine through the courtyard. Finally, Jaciel broke the silence. "Where did you learn to remain so calm?" Brielle looked toward the nursery windows. "My grandmother used to tell me something." "What was that?" "When children are afraid, they borrow courage from the adults beside them." She smiled faintly. "So if I panic, they'll panic too." Jaciel considered her words. "And if you're afraid?" She laughed softly. "Oh, I'm afraid all the time." He looked at her with surprise. "I've simply learned not to let fear decide what I do." The king found himself studying her differently, not because she possessed extraordinary power, but because she possessed extraordinary character. Respect settled quietly within him. Deep, steady, earned. By the following morning, the healers announced that the illness had been contained. The younger pups were recovering. Relief spread throughout the nursery. Several children rushed toward Brielle, wrapping their tiny arms around her. "We're better!" "I knew you would be." Kieran watched the scene with a smile. Then, almost shyly, he stepped closer. "Brielle?" "Yes?" He hesitated. "If I didn't have to be at the palace, could I stay here every day?" Her expression softened. "I think the palace would miss its prince." He looked down. "I'd miss this place more." Brielle gently rested a hand on his shoulder. "The nursery will always be happy to see you." Kieran smiled. He believed her. More than that, he wished it could truly become his home. Watching from a distance, Jaciel saw the quiet exchange. For reasons he couldn't yet explain, it stirred something deep within him. Not jealousy, not possessiveness, only gratitude. Because somewhere inside this humble nursery, his lonely son had found happiness again. And somehow, an Omega named Brielle Thornwood had become the reason why. Chapter 7. Word traveled through Mooncrest, faster than the mountain wind. No official announcement had been made. No council meeting had discussed it. Yet whispers seemed to find every hallway, every training ground, and every marketplace. "They say the prince spends every afternoon in the nursery. I heard he refuses to leave until Brielle tells him it's time. They say even the king has been visiting more often." Most wolves laughed off the rumors. Others dismissed them as harmless gossip. But not everyone. Valeria Thorncrest heard every whispered word. She sat gracefully in the council garden, sipping tea, while several noble she-wolves chatted nearby. "I walked past the nursery yesterday," one of them said. "The prince was carrying storybooks behind that little Omega." Another smiled knowingly. "The king has inspected the nursery 3 times this month." 3? A third asked in surprise. "He's never shown that much interest in the nursery before." Valeria lowered her teacup without making a sound. Outwardly, she remained perfectly composed. Inside, a seed of unease had already begun to grow. For months, she had carefully prepared herself to become the future Luna. She came from one of Mooncrest's oldest bloodlines. She had mastered diplomacy. She attended every council gathering, every royal banquet, every public ceremony. Everything had been carefully planned. Yet somehow, the king seemed more interested in visiting a forgotten nursery than attending conversations she had spent months arranging. It made no sense, unless it wasn't the nursery he was visiting. Her fingers tightened around the delicate porcelain cup. "Who is this Brielle Thornwood?" she asked quietly. One of the women shrugged. "Just an Omega. She looks after the pups. Nothing special. Nothing special." Valeria repeated the words silently. If that were true, then why couldn't she stop hearing Brielle's name? Elsewhere in Mooncrest, another wolf had begun paying close attention. Beta Magnus Blackridge stood overlooking the training grounds, while two younger warriors spoke nearby. "The prince smiled at me yesterday." "You actually spoke to him?" "No. He was with the nursery caretaker." Magnus frowned. "The Omega?" "Yes. They say she's changed him." Magnus dismissed the warriors with a wave. When they had gone, his expression darkened. For years, he had believed influence came from strength. Commanders earned loyalty through victory. Betas earned respect through discipline. That was the natural order. Yet now, a young Omega with no rank, no title, and no political influence seemed to be gaining the trust of both the prince and the king. He didn't like it. Not because Brielle had done anything wrong, because influence, no matter how gentle, could shift the balance of power. And shifting power always created danger. Several days later, Valeria crossed paths with Magnus outside the council chambers. "You've noticed it too," she said, without greeting. Magnus folded his arms. "The Omega." Valeria nodded. The king's attention. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Magnus said quietly, "Perhaps it's nothing." Valeria's eyes narrowed. "And if it isn't?" Magnus looked toward the distant nursery. "The prince trusts her. The king respects her. That combination has changed kingdoms before." Valeria's jaw tightened. "I refuse to let an Omega embarrass every noble family in Mooncrest." Magnus remained thoughtful. "No, you'll simply make sure she never has the opportunity." Their eyes met. Neither needed to explain further. No accusations, no open threats, just an unspoken understanding. If Brielle continued gaining the trust of the royal family, she would eventually become impossible to ignore. Something had to change. Unaware of every whispered conversation, Brielle spent the afternoon exactly where she always did. A tiny pup had scraped his elbow trying to climb a tree. Another insisted his drawing of a wolf looked more like a rabbit. A pair of siblings argued over who had won a game of stones. Brielle patiently settled every disagreement with the same quiet kindness she always showed. "Both of you can be right," she smiled as she handed each sibling a polished stone. "The game isn't about winning. It's about playing together." The children laughed and immediately forgot what they had been arguing about. Across the room, Kieran helped the youngest pup stack colorful wooden blocks. One little girl proudly tugged on Brielle's sleeve. "Look, I made our nursery." She pointed toward the tiny block building. "And this is you." Brielle laughed softly. "Is that really me?" The child nodded enthusiastically. "Because everyone comes here when they're sad." Before Brielle could answer, another tiny voice chimed in. "And Kieran lives here too." The room erupted with laughter. Kieran scratched the back of his neck, pretending to look embarrassed. "I don't live here." "Not yet," another pup teased. Brielle smiled, shaking her head. The simple exchange warmed every corner of the nursery. None of them noticed the servant standing quietly outside the open window. She lingered only long enough to hear the children laughing, then she hurried away. By sunset, the story had already changed. The prince wants to live in the nursery. By nightfall, it became something else. The prince refuses to leave Brielle's side. By the following morning, the rumor reached Valeria. She listened without interrupting. Then she rose gracefully from her chair. "So," she looked toward the nursery in the distance. "Our little Omega has become rather important." Magnus stood beside her. "Important wolves attract attention." Valeria smiled. "But attention can disappear just as quickly." Far across the village, Brielle tucked sleepy pups beneath warm blankets and quietly hummed an old lullaby her grandmother had once sung to her. She smiled as little eyes slowly drifted closed, completely unaware that while she spent her days protecting innocent hearts, someone had already begun plotting to break hers. Chapter 8. The nursery had barely awakened when the peace shattered. Heavy footsteps thundered through the hallway. The doors swung open with enough force to make several younger pups jump. A squad of royal guards entered first, followed by Beta Magnus Blackridge. Behind him walked Valeria Thorncrest, her expression calm, almost sympathetic. The laughter that had filled the room only moments before disappeared. Brielle immediately stood. "Beta Magnus?" His voice was cold. "Brielle Thornwood." She lowered her head respectfully. "Yes, Beta. You are accused of placing the royal pups of Mooncrest in danger." The words struck the room like a bolt of lightning. Every caretaker froze. Even Elowen looked stunned. "I don't understand. You deliberately ignored proper healing procedures during last week's illness." Brielle's eyes widened. "That's not true." Magnus didn't flinch. "Several reports state that you administered herbs without authorization. I only gave the remedies approved by the healers. You also encouraged the prince to remain inside the nursery while the sickness was spreading." "I begged him to stay away," Brielle replied, her voice trembling for the first time. "He came because he wanted to comfort the younger pups." Valeria stepped forward with a quiet sigh. "No one doubts your intentions. But good intentions do not erase dangerous mistakes." Brielle stared at her in disbelief. She had never even spoken to Valeria before. Why was she speaking as though the decision had already been made? "I would never harm a child," Brielle whispered. "I know every one of them. I've cared for them like—" Magnus cut her off. "The council has reached its decision." A hush settled over the nursery. "You are relieved of your duties immediately." The words seemed impossible to understand. Relieved? Of her duties? Brielle looked around the room. Tiny faces stared back at her in confusion. One little girl slowly reached for her hand. "Brielle?" Her heart broke. She knelt and gently brushed the child's hair away from her face. "It's all right." "No," the little girl cried. "You're supposed to stay." Another pup began crying. Then another. Within seconds, the nursery was filled with frightened voices. "Don't take Brielle. She didn't do anything. Please, don't make her go." The sound pierced every heart in the room. Elowen stepped forward. "There must be some mistake." Magnus remained unmoved. "The order stands." Two guards approached Brielle. "You'll gather your belongings." Her fingers tightened around the small woven basket she had carried every day for 3 years. Inside were only a few belongings. A faded storybook, a carved wooden wolf one of the pups had made for her, a small bundle of dried flowers. 3 years of her life, reduced to a single basket. She forced herself to smile at the children. "I need every brave wolf to listen to me." Tiny tear-filled eyes turned toward her. "You'll keep helping each other. You'll keep being kind. And you'll remember that kindness never disappears." Several pups threw their arms around her at once. "We don't want another caretaker. We want you." Brielle hugged them tightly. She wanted to promise she would come back. But she couldn't make promises she wasn't sure she could keep. At that very moment, hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor. "Kieran!" One of the pups cried in relief. The young prince burst through the doorway, breathing hard. He had heard the commotion from halfway across the courtyard. "What happened?" His eyes immediately found Brielle standing beside the guards. Then he saw the basket in her hands. "No." He looked from Brielle to Magnus. "What is this?" Magnus answered formally. "The nursery has been assigned a new caretaker." Kieran frowned. "Where's Brielle going?" "She has been dismissed." For a heartbeat, the prince simply stared. Then he shook his head. "No." Magnus remained silent. "No," Kieran shouted louder. "You can't do that." He hurried to Brielle's side, grabbing her hand with both of his. "Tell them, Brielle. Tell them." She struggled to keep her voice steady. "It's going to be all right." "It isn't." Tears welled in his eyes. "They're lying. You helped everyone. You helped me." The room fell silent. Kieran turned toward Magnus. "You said a king protects innocent people. She's innocent. Why won't anyone protect her?" No one answered. The guards gently stepped forward. "Brielle." She squeezed Kieran's hand one last time, before carefully letting go. "You have to keep being brave." "I don't want to be brave." His voice cracked. "I want you to stay." She smiled through tears that refused to stop falling. "So do I." The guards escorted her toward the doorway. Kieran stood frozen. Then suddenly, he ran. "Brielle." He pushed past one guard and raced after her into the courtyard. "Please, don't leave," his cries echoed across Mooncrest. Servants stopped walking. Warriors turned. Even passing merchants paused. The future Lycan King was crying openly in the middle of the courtyard. He reached Brielle and wrapped both arms around her. "I'll tell father. I'll make him fix this. They can't take you away." Brielle knelt and held him close. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Only tears, only heartbreak. She gently brushed the tears from his cheeks. "You already made my life better than you know. I don't care. I need you." Those 3 words shattered what little strength Brielle had left. She hugged him one final time, before carefully placing his hands into Elowen's. "Take care of him." Then, before she lost the courage to leave, she turned and walked away. Kieran reached toward her again. "Brielle." She never looked back. Not because she didn't want to, because she knew if she did, she would never be able to keep walking. From the upper balcony of the council hall, Lycan King Jaciel had witnessed everything. Every accusation, every tear, every desperate cry from his son. He had never seen Kieran beg for anyone before. Never. As Brielle disappeared beyond the nursery gates, Jaciel's gaze slowly shifted toward Magnus, then to Valeria. Something about the entire scene felt wrong. The evidence had seemed convincing. The council had acted quickly, too quickly. And now, his son was standing in the courtyard, crying as though he'd lost his family. For the first time since the accusations began, a single question settled heavily in the king's mind. Had they just condemned an innocent Omega? Chapter 9. Sleep never came easily to Lycan King Jaciel that night. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the same scene. Kieran standing in the courtyard, tears streaming down his face, begging Brielle not to leave. His son had endured years of demanding lessons, relentless training, and the loneliness of royal life without shedding a single tear before others. Yet the moment Brielle walked away, he had broken. Jaciel stood before the palace window, staring into the darkness that blanketed Mooncrest. Something was wrong. Not with Kieran, with the accusations. The evidence had appeared too quickly. The judgment had come too easily. And Brielle, she had never once defended herself by blaming another. She had only worried about the pups. The more he thought about it, the less it made sense. As dawn approached, Jaciel made his decision. He summoned only one wolf, Commander Riker. The seasoned commander entered the chamber and bowed respectfully. "You called for me, Alpha." Jaciel turned. "I want the truth." Riker frowned. "The truth about what?" Brielle Thornwood. No one else was to know about the investigation. Not the council, not the elders, not even Magnus. "If she's guilty," Jaciel said, "I want proof. And if she isn't," his golden eyes hardened, "I want whoever lied to answer before the entire kingdom." Riker bowed once more. "It will be done." For the next 2 days, Riker quietly retraced every step leading to Brielle's dismissal. He questioned the royal healers who had treated the sick pups. One healer frowned in confusion. "Unauthorized herbs, no. Everything Brielle used came from our approved stores." Another caretaker admitted something strange. The medicine shelves had been rearranged the night before the accusations. By whom? I don't know. Riker continued digging. Then he found the guard assigned to the nursery storeroom. At first, the young guard insisted he had seen nothing unusual, but under careful questioning, his confidence faded. There was someone. Who? He hesitated. "I saw Lady Valeria leaving the eastern corridor late that night. The nursery was already closed." Riker's expression darkened. What was she doing there? "I don't know. But she wasn't alone. Who was with her?" The guard swallowed nervously. "Beta Magnus." One final piece remained missing. Riker searched the storage room himself. Hidden behind a stack of empty herb baskets, he discovered a sealed pouch. Inside were herbs that should never have been stored with children's medicine. They had been planted there deliberately. The truth became impossible to deny. Brielle had never endangered the pups. Someone had carefully built a lie around her. By sunset, Riker returned to the palace. He placed the pouch before Jaciel. Then he explained everything. The altered storeroom, The false reports, the witnesses, the guard. The silence that followed felt heavier than stone. Jasiel looked at the evidence for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was frighteningly calm. They framed her. Yes, Alpha. They used frightened children to destroy an innocent Omega. Riker lowered his head. Jasiel's jaw tightened. His anger wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The quiet fury in his eyes was enough to make even the seasoned commander uneasy. Call the council. Summon every elder, every commander, every citizen. Riker looked up. The entire pack, the entire kingdom deserves to hear the truth. By the following afternoon, nearly all of Mooncrest had gathered within the central square. Warriors lined the outer walls. Families filled the stone steps. The council stood near the platform, where Jasiel addressed the kingdom during important announcements. Whispers spread through the crowd. What happened? Why were we summoned? Has another rogue attack begun? Valeria stood among the noble families, perfectly composed. Magnus folded his arms confidently beside the council. Neither suspected what was about to happen. At last, Jasiel stepped onto the platform. Silence swept across the square. His gaze moved slowly across the crowd before settling on Magnus. Then Valeria. His voice carried across the entire kingdom. Several days ago, an Omega named Brielle Thornwood was accused of endangering the pups of Mooncrest. Many wolves nodded solemnly. Those accusations, he paused, were false. A ripple of shock spread through the crowd. Magnus stiffened. Valeria's calm expression faltered for the first time. Jasiel raised the sealed pouch. This evidence was planted. Our healers confirmed Brielle followed every proper procedure. Witnesses have come forward. The accusations were manufactured. The crowd erupted into stunned murmurs. RCL's gaze turned icy. Commander Riker. Riker stepped forward. He calmly presented the testimonies. The guard's account, the altered storeroom, the hidden herbs, one by one, every lie unraveled before the eyes of the kingdom. Magnus finally stepped forward. Alpha, surely, there has been some misunderstanding. Jasiel's voice cut through the square like steel. The only misunderstanding was believing loyalty gave you permission to destroy innocence. Magnus fell silent. Valeria tried to recover. I acted only out of concern for the prince. Jasiel looked directly at her. If concern guided your actions, you would have sought the truth. Instead, you chose ambition. Neither could answer. Before the entire kingdom, the masks they had carefully worn finally shattered. Jasiel faced the gathered wolves once more. Brielle Thornwood's name is cleared. From this day forward, no accusation against her shall remain upon the records of Mooncrest. Relief swept through the crowd. Many lowered their heads in shame. Some remembered every cruel rumor they had repeated. Others silently regretted doubting the quiet Omega who had devoted herself to their children. Jasiel's expression remained firm. Magnus Blackridge, you are stripped of your authority pending judgment. Magnus's face drained of color. Valeria Thorncrest, you are forbidden from holding any position within the Royal Council until further notice. The noblewoman stood speechless. Everything she had worked toward vanished in a single afternoon. Justice had finally arrived. Yet Jasiel knew. One thing remained unfinished. He looked across the silent crowd, then spoke one final sentence. Tomorrow, I will make one more announcement. It concerns Brielle Thornwood. No one dared speak. Every wolf watched as the Lycan King stepped down from the platform. For the first time, the kingdom understood that the story of the forgotten Omega was far from over. Chapter 10. The following morning, Brielle returned to Mooncrest expecting nothing more than an apology. After Commander Riker had found her in a small cottage beyond the eastern woods and explained that her name had been cleared, she assumed the Lycan King simply wished to restore her position in the nursery. Nothing more. As she walked through the village, wolves who had once looked past her now lowered their heads respectfully. Some quietly apologized. Others stepped aside to let her pass. Brielle acknowledged each of them with the same gentle smile she had always worn. There was no bitterness in her heart, only relief that the truth had finally been revealed. When she reached the central square, she stopped in surprise. Nearly the entire kingdom had gathered once again. Warriors stood in neat rows. Pack leaders lined the stone platform. Families filled every corner of the square. Even the nursery pups stood together beside Elowin, eagerly searching the crowd. "What is all this?" Brielle whispered. Before anyone could answer, the royal horns echoed through Mooncrest. Lycan King Jaciel stepped onto the platform. Silence settled over the gathering. His golden eyes swept across the crowd before finally resting on Brielle. Brielle Thornwood. She stepped forward and bowed respectfully. "You summoned me, Alpha." "I did." His voice carried across the square. "Yesterday, this kingdom learned that you were falsely accused." A murmur spread through the crowd. "But clearing your name is not enough." Brielle looked up in quiet confusion. Jaciel continued. An injustice was committed, but something even greater was overlooked. He slowly descended from the platform until he stood only a few steps away from her. "When I first entered the nursery, I asked you a question." Brielle remembered it instantly. "What can you offer this kingdom, Omega?" She had answered without thinking. "I can't offer much, but I can care for pups." Jaciel nodded. "At the time, I believed strength was measured by titles, by victories, by authority." He looked toward the gathered warriors. "I was wrong." The entire square fell silent. Then the king turned toward Kieran. "My son spent months surrounded by tutors, commanders, and servants. They taught him how to rule. They taught him how to fight. They taught him how to command." His gaze returned to Brielle. "But you taught him how to care." Kieran's eyes filled with tears. Jaciel continued. "You reminded him that courage is not the absence of fear, that kindness is not weakness, and that the strongest leader is often the one who makes others feel seen." Many wolves lowered their heads. Some remembered dismissing Brielle as just an Omega. Now they realized how deeply they had misjudged her. Jaciel's voice softened. "You changed my son." He paused. Then, for the first time, he spoke words he had never expected to say. "And somewhere along the way, you changed me." Brielle's eyes widened. "I watched you comfort frightened pups without seeking recognition. I watched you remain calm while others panicked. I watched you continue choosing kindness after this kingdom failed to choose it for you." He looked around at the gathered wolves. "There are warriors stronger than Brielle. There are nobles with older bloodlines. There are leaders with greater titles. But none possess a heart more worthy of leading this kingdom." The square became so quiet that only the wind could be heard. Then, before anyone could guess what he intended, Jaciel extended his hand toward Brielle. "When this kingdom searched for its future, we looked toward power. We looked toward status. We looked toward ancient bloodlines." He smiled faintly. The answer was quietly sitting in a nursery. A tear slipped down Brielle's cheek. She hadn't realized she was crying until that moment. Jaciel took one final step closer. "Brielle Thornwood, you once told me you had little to offer. I disagree." He drew a slow breath. "You offered this kingdom something it had forgotten. Compassion. You offered my son something no throne ever could. A place where he felt safe. And you reminded your king that a true leader earns hearts before commanding them." He held out his hand once more. "That is why I ask you to stand beside me, not because of your rank, not because of your bloodline, but because you have already shown every wolf here what it truly means to lead." The crowd collectively held its breath. Then, "Kieran!" The young prince could no longer contain himself. He raced through the crowd before anyone could stop him. "Brielle!" He threw his arms around her with all the strength an 8-year-old could muster. "You came back." His voice trembled. "I thought I'd lost you forever." Brielle knelt and hugged him tightly. "You'll never lose the place you have in my heart." Kieran looked up at Jaciel, hope shining through tear-filled eyes. "Does this mean she can stay?" Jaciel smiled at his son. "Yes." A grin spread across Kieran's face, the kind of smile that only comes after believing all hope has been lost. The nursery pups erupted into joyful cheers. Several rushed forward, surrounding Brielle in a whirlwind of tiny hugs and happy laughter. Even the warriors standing guard couldn't hide their smiles. Elowin quietly wiped away tears. This is where she always belonged, she whispered. Jaciel looked across the kingdom one final time. Let every pack remember this day. Not because a king chose his Luna, but because this kingdom finally recognized the worth of a woman who had always been worthy. Thunderous applause echoed across Mooncrest. Not for power, not for status, but for kindness. As Brielle looked around the square, she saw the faces of the children she had comforted. The prince who had become family. The king who had learned to see beyond rank. For years, she had believed no one noticed Omegas. She had been wrong. Sometimes, the quietest hearts leave the deepest mark. And on that day, before an entire kingdom, the Omega no one had seen became the Luna everyone would remember. Sometimes, the strongest hearts aren't the loudest. They don't wear crowns, command armies, or seek recognition. They simply choose kindness, day after day, even when no one is watching. Brielle never set out to become a Luna. She simply chose to love the pups everyone else overlooked. And in doing so, she reminded an entire kingdom that true leadership begins with compassion. If Brielle's journey touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. What was your favorite moment in her story? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoy heartfelt werewolf stories filled with love, justice, and unforgettable characters, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for spending this journey with us. Until next time, take care, and remember, even the smallest act of kindness can change someone's world.